Welcome to the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast, a show that examines all aspects of sexuality, from physical to emotional to spiritual. Join our hosts as they discuss age-old questions, common misconceptions, and the latest topics surrounding sex. They'll tackle topics about sexuality from the complicated to the hilarious and everything in between. GSMC Sex Podcast is your show for all of your questions about sex, even some you might not have thought of yet.
Thank you so much for once again tuning into the GSMC Sex Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Ayana Janae, and today we are going to be talking about something that's very common to discuss in our culture. I think the narrative is shifting a bit, maybe, kind of, sort of. I can only speak for the circles that I am in, and kind of the energy that I surround myself with, but I cannot speak for the entire collective energy and culture. And that thing that I am talking about is virginity. I've always had my own thoughts on the concept of virginity, even as a quote-unquote virgin. But as I got older and began to delve deeper into sex and sexual history, I began to understand a bit more about why I had those already kind of internal feelings about the word or the concept, the idea, however you want to refer to it as. And it kind of clarified why I was feeling that, and made me realize, this isn't a thing per se. Not really, but I mean that's true for most things, honestly. Nothing is a thing. It's not a thing. It's not a thing. But what I will do as the show progresses is as the episode progresses is get into the history of virginity, how it has affected our culture, how the concept or the idea in particular has affected our culture, and also just some key points in how it's affected my life, but also some other things to consider when thinking about virginity. So to start, I'll say I don't like the concept of virginity, but similar to that, I also don't like the concept of what it means to be a whore, or what it means to be a slut, or whatever other derogatory term exists to differentiate or turn women against each other, or shame women, or whatever the case may be, because ultimately the purpose of the term virginity was meant to shame women, but I'll get more into that in the second segment. But I never really liked the term. I was just always like, it hasn't, okay, I won't say always, because there was a time when I kind of fed into it because it's just what I was taught. So growing up as a Christian, you are told, like, you're supposed to be a virgin on your wedding night. No one's gonna want you if you're not a virgin. And that's crappy to say. No one's gonna want you. But unfortunately, depending on where you go to church, or whoever the preacher or pastor is, and how they choose to indoctrinate you, that's kind of how it's given. Nobody's gonna want you. this, like, you have to be a virgin. If you're not a virgin, you're worthless, you're useless. And I won't say it was that extreme, but perceptively, that is how it came across. So I grew up as a Christian. I grew up having to, not necessarily, I won't say I believed it, but I was taught, I was indoctrinated to believe that if you are a virgin, you are at a certain standard, you're more pristine than those who are not, you're better to a degree. Never heard this about men, which is also something else that we're going to get into in later segments. Never heard this in particular about men, but it's always in reference to women. Whether biblically, historically, whatever the case may be, the aspect of virginity has always pandered to an essence of womanhood and what true womanhood meant. So imagine me growing up, or some of you probably grew up the same way, honestly, but imagine me growing up and saying, I am going to, and also, not to mention people coming and giving us we got dog tags for being virgins, for choosing to stay pure, which purity is a load of crap. But choosing to stay pure and to stay virgins so that we can be looked at in a particular way in the eyes of God, we received dog tags that said, I promise to da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da in the name of God. Amen. Or something like that. I'm really paraphrasing. And so just imagine how afraid I am when I have a boyfriend in like middle school. I had quote unquote boyfriends before that, but like you get to middle school and everybody's hitting puberty and suddenly sex is just everything. So imagine me getting to middle school and I won't say discover sex, but truly begin to understand myself sexually and my body, my genitals, etc., and just get more in touch with myself. And it's just like suddenly, I don't want to be a virgin. I don't want to be a virgin at 11 years old. I don't want to be a virgin. Who cares? And I don't know how that just suddenly clicked at 11. But it was just like, I like my body. There's nothing, because even with virginity, it teaches you to be quote unquote modest. And you have to dress a particular way. And if you dress anything opposite of that, then it makes you somewhat less than. So somehow I get to the thought of, I don't want to be a virgin. Who cares? And I start, like, I also get more into music around 9, 10, 11 years old. Particularly at 11 is when I start listening to more sexually explicit lyrics. And the lyrics begin to make me feel things. And the lyrics also begin to resonate with me in a particular way. And I'm just like, yeah, I like that. I'm 11. It's like, yeah, that's cool. Yeah. Who cares about who cares? It's just sex. It's not gonna make me any different. It doesn't make these people any less than. But then, even then, somehow it does, particularly if you listen to certain women, female rappers and female R&B artists or female artists in general. If they present a particular way, they will be to some degree they will be condemned. Again, the tides are turning. Like right now my favorite artist is Meg Thee Stallion, but but people still condemn her. And there are people who condemn her and people who condemn artists like Lil' Kim and artists like Nicki Minaj and all of these women who embrace their sexuality, who disregard the concept of quote unquote purity and that particular idea of womanhood, and they are condemned because they portray it the way that they do, because they speak up about it in their music, and also in how they speak up about it in their music, which I love. But you see that, and you see how much this concept of purity among women has been perpetrated, and it's been, even now, the people who condemn these women are not just men, also women. And there are women who truly believe that if they live up to that standard of piety and purity, and they continue to perpetuate I'll say perpetuate the foolishness, because that's just what it is to me. They continue to perpetuate those things, perpetuate these ideas. It will somehow make them more appeasing to the male gaze, more appealing to men, or to the opposite sex. Because mostly, and I don't want to generalize, but a lot of times it does tend to be heterosexual, cisgendered women who are saying these things. I won't say I've never seen a queer woman say these things. It's kind of rare, but also I'm a queer woman, so I don't say these things. But also that is when, I think that's also part of it as well, because when I was 11, that's when I started understanding my sexuality a bit more as well, and started to understand, like, okay, this is what it means. Like, you not only like boys, you also like girls, and that's okay too. And then I started discovering more things about sexuality in general, which brought me to better understand myself, and then understand the truth of what virginity is and what it was created for, and how it has affected a lot of society, and what it's rooted in. And so again, imagine seeing these women. Imagine growing up, being 11 years old, and saying, me growing up and being 11 years old, and suddenly saying, I don't get it. What's the point? And then these women who are talking about these things, they're so strong, and they're so powerful, and they're so beautiful, and they believe in who they are, and they are so amazing. I want to be like that. Maybe it's okay to not be a virgin. And maybe it's okay for me to be sexually liberated, and to be explicit about my sexuality, and not so explicit to the point where I'm always talking about it, which, to be clear, that is what I was doing. I was the friend who always talked about sex, who always knew everything about sex, and was very free about it and didn't care. I was also considered the quote-unquote freak in elementary school. Freak being the sexual term, not meaning like being different or anything, but being like, oh, she's freaky, she's nasty. And that's just because of this. That's just what it was in the circles that I ran with at that time. Oh, children. But I became that person because this is where I began to truly understand that certain things are put in place to keep women like me in their place, quote unquote. And I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to be that. Being a natural born rebel, I never wanted that. For myself, for my friends, for my children. Even though, again, there was a moment where I perpetuated the same idea that if I do X, Y, and Z, or if I do not do X, Y, and Z, then I am better than the woman or the girl who, well, I'll say the girl, because as a woman, I'm not that way, but I am better than those girls who do those things, who are more sexual, or who dress a certain way, or whatever the case may be. That's my phrase. And so again, I fed into that. But once I began to truly understand how that came to be, how that thought process came to be, what it's rooted in, and what it was designed to do, and how it affected me if I continue to perpetuate it, I said, oh no, I will never, ever conform to foolishness. I will never, ever conform to control, to being controlled, especially not in this way. I'm going to do what I want to do. So, after our break, we are going to get into the history of what I'm talking about. So, stay tuned. And, yeah, we will be right back.
Still on the search of that one true love? On the limbo in this crazy world of dating, marriage, relationships? Well, listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, your one-stop podcast for everything about relationships.
Alright, and we are back. So as I mentioned already, we are discussing virginity. And so in the previous section or segment, I discussed my experience with virginity. Well, not my full experience, but how the concept affected my thought process. And as I began to learn more about it, how I shifted my thought process and also shifted not only that, but my perspective of the world. And so now we are about to get into the history. Where does this come from? What is the root of virginity? And why is it here? So, the origin of virginity. In the Middle Ages, virginity was a sought-after commodity, primarily because it was the surest method to guarantee paternity. The only way to make absolutely sure that a child born to a marriage, a child who would inherit property from his father, is a legitimate heir, was to bed a virgin bride. This was known as the paternity property hypothesis, which placed virgin women as material property. Their purpose was to become pregnant, raise children, and make sure the paternal family line continued. By creating the concept of virginity, a father could assure the family of the groom that there were no children from other males. I don't like that for obvious reasons, but I think about my current perspective and where I am now in history. Right now in history, I am in a space where there is so much advanced technology that the idea that the only way for you to know that the child that I birth with you is yours is to make sure that I'm a virgin beforehand. It's wild to me. It baffles me. But again, that is just because of where I live in history. And so, I'm not agreeing with these things. It's not right or wrong, but I do think it is important to look at things from a historical perspective, and to understand the culture which culture is something we'll get into later. It is very important to understand the culture during that particular time period. And when you think about it, back then they didn't have any other way to truly know. Sure, the child could look like you, but then what do you do if... So me and my brother, we watch Paternity Court, if you've never seen it. It's a show about people trying to figure out the paternity of their children. Think Maury and Divorce Court had a child. So we watch that, and we watch how it's so easy for a child to look like a person that you want the child's father to be when you have a particular type. So it's like we see a lot of cases where the mother is like, my child looks just like you, and da-da-da-da, and da-da-da-da, where there's a question because you have a type. Your child looks like this person, sure, but there's another person that you have also been having sex with in the same time frame that you were having sex with this particular person, and they favor a good bit. So this child looks like this person, but in some ways this child also looks like this person. Thus, paternity has to be determined. And so I'm sure back then it was like, I can see how it was the only way to determine the paternity of a child. It's like, okay, well, I know that I'm the only person that this woman has ever, this girl, because let's really be honest, they were forcing girls to get married and birth. Not even a month or two after having their first menstrual cycle, if we really want to be honest. But I can see how that is a thing, how that was a thing. I'll say not is a thing, because in my mind, because again, because back then, it didn't matter if you had a type, because women were property. And so women being property, it really doesn't matter if you have a type or not. But who's to say that woman or that girl was not raped at some point and or sexually assaulted at some point, and she's no longer a virgin. It doesn't mean that the child that you birth with her or bear with her is not yours just because she's no longer a virgin, especially if no child came after that assault. Which kind of leads me to my next point, but first let me finish this up, because the methods of determining paternity have shifted because culture has shifted, times have shifted, and so it's baffling to me to think that is the only way to determine paternity, because again, even if the woman is not a quote-unquote virgin, if she has a child by you and the child looks like you, and more than likely she didn't really have a choice in the matter, because she is considered property. She doesn't particularly probably have a type, so it won't be like the child looks like somebody else, and looks like you, because she didn't have a type. I tried to make this match with modern day concepts. If you can kind of get what I'm saying, great. If not, I do apologize. But yeah, it really is surprising to me to think that. But again, it leads me to my next point about rape. So there's a law called Creighton's Law, and it's from 450 BC. And what it says is, if you, this is just another historical fact that I found, and what it says is, during 450 BC or around that time period, if a virgin girl or woman is sexually assaulted or raped, and this goes back to women and girls being treated like property. If they are raped, the rapist has to pay the father for destruction of property or damaging of property. I don't like that, of course, because I don't like the topic in general of rape. I don't like rape at all. Sexual assault of any type. Keep your hands to yourself. Be a decent human being. But unfortunately, women were not treated as human beings. Girls were not treated as human beings. They were treated as property. They were a commodity. The only reason that they existed at the time of, well, from a cultural perspective of that particular time, is to bear children, to continue a paternal lineage. And they were basically like cattle. We only need you for your parts. We don't need to understand what you are feeling or how this assault has affected you. That does not matter. What does matter is that you are my property, and at this point you have been damaged because someone has damaged you. Someone has vandalized you. And that is how virgin women were looked at and virgin girls were looked at back then. And I wish y'all could see me because I keep saying virgin with air quotes because I really don't believe in virginity. But yeah, another historical fact that I found pertaining to virginity is that this is one that I liked, actually. In ancient Egypt, during the New Kingdom, particularly 1570 BC and between 1570 BC and 1544 BC, it was not essential to be a virgin before marriage. It was assumed that sexual intercourse was socially acceptable during this time. That is also a cultural thing as well, particularly because Egypt, Africa, things are different due to colonization now, but pre-colonization, things were very, very different. But it is assumed that sexual intercourse was socially acceptable during this time. However, once married, both couples were expected to be exclusively monogamous. So I can kind of get with that. Again, cultures have shifted, and so monogamy is not, I won't say it's not as important because it's still kind of the quote-unquote norm, but so that particular aspect of it, it's like the forcing to be monogamous is a thing that I don't like. However, I do like that sexual intercourse is the norm. Great. It's not that deep. It's not that serious. Virginity is not real. Another historical fact I found was famed Greek historian Herodotus, back in 450 BC, mentioned the virgin testing with the Amazons of Scythia. According to historical accounts, whose accuracy have not been verified, Scythian Amazon girls were not considered women until they had killed a man in battle. So this particular idea of virginity is a bit different. Because it's not different in the sense that it does still control women and girls, but if you kill a man in battle, that is the only way that you are to be considered a woman, and thus you no longer have to be a quote-unquote virgin, because you have been purified in the sense that you have killed someone. That is an interesting take on it, and it was one that stood out to me the most, because it's just like, kill a man, you're a woman, but you have to kill him in battle. But it's like, kill a man, you're a woman, you can have sex, great. But again, what I still don't like is the control aspect of it. Like, this is the only time that you can have sex, and this is the only time that you can be considered a woman. Forget age. which very problematic, because that means a 12-year-old can kill a man in battle, and that they're a woman, but they're 12. Virginity in the ancient world might have. So, another fact for the ancient world, I'll say, is that virginity in the ancient world might have referred to whether a woman was married or single. I can see how that's a thing simply because of what I talked about in the sex magic episode about sex being a ritual. So ultimately, sex is a ritual, or it is something that is done. It is a symbolic act that is really meant to solidify a marriage. That's all. And so I can see how they said, well, if they've had sex, that means that they are married, because this is how sex has been viewed in a spiritual sense. It is, but even now, it's really just a connection. It is a connection. But before having to write down papers and marriage certificates and things of that nature, you had sex in order to symbolize the connection. And so I remember going to church, and somebody said sex is marriage, and so I can see that, but I don't see it from the perspective I don't see it from a Christian perspective particularly, but I do see it from the perspective that it is a ritual, and it is a ritual meant to solidify a thing, solidify a marriage, solidify a union. So I get it from that perspective. So now we are about to get into culture and how all of these facts have contributed, or all of the history, how all of this history has contributed to culture. And we've gotten into how it's contributed to certain cultures, but we'll get into how it's contributed to our modern culture. But first, we are going to take a quick break, and then we'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
And we are back. So, we've talked about the history of virginity, where it came from, where it got its roots, and now we are going to talk about the culture that virginity has created. So, as we discussed, the purpose for virginity was ultimately the commodification and materialization of women. So, keeping in mind the prescription of value to women who were virgins and the commodification of women for the purpose of procreation and the prevalence of that idea in Christianity, the occurrence of colonization made the idea of purity what it is today, particularly in the U.S., and that has in turn affected our sex education system. This is my number one thing as far as culture is concerned, because I see it a lot. I saw it a lot growing up. the idea of virginity being so important that we are miseducated about sex. So it's like you have to stay abstinence, especially in the South. Abstinence-based sex education is heavily taught, and because of that, we're not taught anything about contraception. I won't say we're not taught anything about it, but we're not as educated about it as we should be, unless we go seek the information for ourselves. But sex education in schools and things like that, particularly in the South, abstinence. Don't have sex. If you've seen Mean Girls and you say, well, they're in California, but if you've seen Mean Girls and you've seen the scene where they're in sex ed, or they're in PE really, but the coach is teaching sex ed, and he's like, don't have sex. Don't have sex standing up. Don't have sex in the missionary position. Just don't have sex. And so with that, you see the and that's their education, their sex education for their time in high school. And with that, you see the cognitive dissonance between what he really feels and what he is told to say. And it's like, why? I know it's a joke, it's satire, but it's like, why is he told to say this? It really, that's the point of the satire. It makes you think this is something that really happens. And so it's like, don't have sex standing up, don't have sex in missionary position, just don't have sex. Okay, everybody grabs some rubbers, and he passes out condoms because he's like, okay, really, we're in high school. Not we're in high school, you're in high school, you're gonna do it. And especially because we're telling you not to. I know you're going to. And we're not truly educating you on having sex. And so I would rather you be prepared, because I know that without proper education, you're gonna go experiment for yourself. You're probably not gonna try to read about it for yourself. You're probably just gonna try to experiment for yourself. And so I would rather you be prepared in this way. This is what I got from that as an adult, in the satire of it all. But that is something that really happens. It's like, this is stuff that I'm supposed to teach. I'm supposed to teach you not the true facts of life, but the facts of life that I want you to conform to. And that has a lot to do with virginity and virginity among women, and the controlling of people's bodies, the controlling of women's bodies. I can recall being in elementary school and receiving, the girls and the boys receiving two different talks. So the girls received the talk about abstinence, don't have sex, don't do X, Y, and Z, you're gonna get pregnant, you're gonna get HIV, if you have sex, you can't have sex. And then the boys, they're taught about their bodies, and did you know we have wet dreams, and and we're 7. It's like, did you know we can have wet dreams, and did you know our penises can get erect, and Now, of course, they weren't particularly using the language erect, but you get the point. And so even then, they are teaching us early on that your bodies are under our control in this way. And it is creating a particular culture, or perpetuating the cycle of a culture. Because even that, I want to say, in a sense, it can feed into rape culture. And it's just because not being properly educated about sex education does very well feed into rape culture. Because especially if you don't teach children early on about consent, which I talked about in the sex education episode. So that is something that is a very important cultural factor to me, that virginity, the idea of virginity, has contributed to. Another thing, or another way that it has affected the culture in general, is marriage. if you look back at marriages, so you think about a marriage, the traditional marriage is the father giving the child away, giving the daughter away to the husband. Now, where that comes from is it's basically a transaction, which is why I'm kind of iffy about marriage, about the institution of marriage in general, because I really don't necessarily need a piece of paper to tell me that I love someone. But that's really because it's really a business deal. It's a business transaction. Right now, even if your parents don't give you away, it is a business deal to partner up with someone in life in order to. So if I do sign that piece of paper, it is for business purposes, to ensure that the finances are a particular way, to ensure that insurance is a particular way, healthcare, things of that nature. But back then, it was like the father is giving the daughter away because she was his property. The daughter was his property, and now this man is paying a... How did it go? There were dowries. So who pays the dowry? However it's paid. Someone pays a dowry. So think about a financial transaction. I am paying you for this property that has been kept, I'm paying you for this property that has been kept in good condition for this long, and I am selling her to you, or they would probably use the term it, whatever. I am selling her to you in order for you to do whatever it is that you want with her and to use her as you wish. And I deem you worthy enough to handle her, or I deem you worthy enough to buy her from me, in order to and I don't, in order to continue your family. And I don't really, of course, I don't like that, because it's like, I deem you worthy enough to have my property. It's like inheritance. Like, this is the child that is worthy enough to have my inheritance. This is the person that is worthy enough to have this item, this precious, valuable thing to me. And it can seem romanticized, like, my daughter is so precious to me and blah, 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 and blah, blah, blah. But really, you view your daughter as something that you have created because your DNA is in her. And you don't mind sharing your DNA with this person, or giving your DNA to this person. Because if I can, it's okay to, I deem you worthy enough to give this thing that I've made, to give my property to. It's fine. I don't know what you're going to do with it, but your family's rich, or your family is stable. Your family has this many acres or whatever. So that's fine. And it doesn't matter if she wants to. I deem you worthy enough, which is where arranged marriages came from. And then also, the way that culture has been affected is the romanticism of virginity and quote unquote losing your virginity. For most people, most girls or women who have sex for the first time, it's not all that great. There's pain. My first sexual interaction, for me, it wasn't that bad. But I also prided myself on liking pain, which I've healed from. Those are issues that I've had. I had those issues back then. It was like, I like pain, I'm fine. But, back then, even then, it didn't, I don't even think it hurt that bad. And it was just because the partner that I had at the time was sure to be gentle with me, because he knew that it was my first time having sex. But then another thing that does is it downplays the idea of virginity. It downplays, because what is considered to be sexual intercourse is intercourse, like the penile vaginal penetration. That is what is deemed to be sexual intercourse, and so it takes away from lesbian relationships, and even oral sex, anal sex. And that is also an issue that I've had, because I didn't like, one thing growing up that I saw, I didn't like people saying, we just had anal sex and so I'm still a virgin, or I don't count it as sex. Anal sex is still sex. Oral sex is still sex. Mutual masturbation is still sex. It is a sexual act performed with another person. Even, honestly, you have self-sex all the time, because masturbation with self, that's sex. It is a sexual act. If it has the intent of sexual expression and things of that nature, it's sex. But because virginity has been deemed so important, it has been very common to see people, especially teenagers, say things like that. Well, it was just anal, so it doesn't count. Or it was just oral, so it didn't count. Or we just played with each other, so it didn't count. It's still sex. Sorry to burst your bubble. It's still sex. And then another way that virginity another thing that I see in culture is how fathers react to their daughters compared to their sons. How fathers react to their daughters having sex for the first time, and knowing that their daughters are no longer quote unquote virgins. It has less to do with, and this is my perspective, I'll say, I think it has less to do with their daughter, and more to do with this: she was my property and I was supposed to give her away. That's what the undertone is, because you only get that upset about your possessions, about things that you have spent money on and things like. So if someone, you feel slighted, you feel like someone has stolen something from you. And so that's what I think that's rooted in. I may be thinking too deep about it, too hard about it, but how I view it is the father seeing, when situations like that occur, the father tends to feel slighted, because my daughter has, without my permission, taken control of her body and done what she's wanted to do, but she was supposed to get my permission to do that, or I was supposed to give her away, or I was supposed to deem that person worthy of having access to my property. Your daughter is a human. Only your daughter can determine who is worthy of having access to her. So we're going to get into some fun facts. But we're going to do that after this break. And these are some interesting fun facts that I found. So I'll be right back after this break.
Are you tired of the same old news? Are you sick of the seemingly endless political spin and negativity? The GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast is a weekly news podcast covering all the top positive and uplifting news stories. We cover stories that will inspire, uplift, and remind you of the good in the world. Tune into the Golden State Media Concepts America Still Beautiful podcast to get all the great and positive news stories of today. Download the GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast on iTunes, iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
And we are back. So, as we discussed, virginity isn't real. No. If you believe in virginity, I have absolutely nothing against that. But if you, I do think it's important for you to understand the history of virginity, rather than believing something based on what you have been indoctrinated to believe. Delve a bit deeper and see where everything comes from, and then try to make your decision based on that. So now, and we've also discussed how the history has affected culture, and so now we are going to get into the fun facts. So one of the very interesting fun facts that I have found is that there was the belief in a virgin cure. And the virgin cure, or the idea of the virgin cure, is basically if you have an STD, you can have sex with a virgin and be cured. That only passes the STD. That only passes the STD to another person. That does not cure the STD. Please, let's be clear. You are passing it along. You are not healing yourself. You are infecting someone else. Please, don't do that. And that even went, that was during the AIDS time. There was an idea that if you had AIDS, you could have sex with a virgin and be cured. No, someone else just have AIDS now. Now you and someone else have it. The next one that I found was virgin testing was a thing. Now that's not something that I didn't know. I'd heard that before as a teenager, and there was a point where I believed it just because I didn't know any better, and I believed it so much that when I was 16, when I was 15 actually, I was the first person that I was sexually active with. He was older. I was 15 and he was 18, and we met when I was 14 and he was 17. So, statutory rapey, I know. As a teenager, you think, oh, that's so cool, this older guy likes me, and da-da-da-da, and all these other things, but really, he just knows he can take advantage of you, because he was known for doing that. Like, he was known for interacting most with underclassmen. But, my mom knew who he was, but she didn't know, well, she found out, of course, but she didn't know that I had been sneaking him into the house while she was asleep. And I would sneak him in through my window, because where my room was right in front of, like, at the front of the house, and my mom's room was at the back of the house. So, well, not at the back, but towards the back. The center, back, whatever. My room was towards the front. So it was easy for him to just sneak in through my window. He was tall. My window was up a bit high, but he was tall, so he just jumped. And so my mom found out, and it had been happening quite often. And my mom found out from a neighbor. The neighbor told her that it was happening very often. And I got in trouble for it. And my mom said, I'm going to take you to the pediatrician and get you tested and blah, blah, blah. And she asked me had I been having sex, and I wanted to lie really, really bad. I said no. And then she was like, I can find out. Me having heard that virginity testing existed and not knowing that it was a lie, I really thought it was true. And I was like, oh gosh, she's gonna find out. And I also didn't know at the time, like, pediatricians don't really have to tell your parents that. But you live and you learn. But I ended up telling my mom because I really believe that virginity testing was a thing. And what virginity testing is, or what it has been, is just the inspection for the existence of a hymen. There's fallacy in that simply because, or not fallacy, but like there's an issue with that simply because your hymen can tear from anything. I had a friend, she tore her hymen when she was about 8, and she did it during gymnastics. I think she hit a split too hard, and her hymen tore that way. People's hymens have torn, people's hymens have torn from horseback riding. People's hymens have torn from bike riding. So just because your hymen is torn, or the existence of a hymen, or non-existence rather, it's not enough to prove one's quote-unquote virginity, or to be able to tell whether or not they have had sex. It also, the virginity test also tests the width of the vagina, and even that is not, there's no validity to that, because you can have a wider set vagina. No one vagina is alike. No two vaginas are alike. Every vagina is different. So, yeah, virginity test. Another fun fact that I found, so you know purity balls, and you give balls. When I first read this, my mind, like, this isn't my first time reading it, but when I first read it, I was like, purity balls? What's that? And I knew what they were, but like my mind went elsewhere. So, purity balls are when you have a dance with it's like a daddy-daughter dance, but it is a daughter pledging her virginity, quote unquote, to her father until marriage, which feeds back into the thing about marriage and property and things like that we talked about earlier. And so it's basically like, my virginity belongs to you until I get married, and then when I get married, because it belongs to you now, you can give it to whomever, or to whoever I'm getting married to, or whatever. So there's that. But then there's integrity balls. And so with integrity balls, they further perpetuate the idea of property and being respectful to other people's property, because they're the male version, but it's like, it's not sons pledging their virginities to their mothers or anything like that. It's pledging to not have sex because that girl or that woman can possibly be someone else's property. I don't know if I want her to be my property, so that means she could very well be someone else's property, and I don't want to destroy or damage their property. So I have the integrity to not have sex with that because of that. So I found that very interesting. Another fun fact that I found, because of, there are some areas where it's still prevalent, and where virginity is still prevalent, or the idea or the concept of it is still very important. And so I found it very interesting to know that you can buy an artificial hymen or a virginity kit on the internet. And I found this article on HuffPost, but it says there are fake hymens found online for about $30. First of all, why even go to such lengths? But I do understand, again, there are some areas where it's still very important. But also, the vagina is, if virginity is that valuable, $30? That's all? Wow. That's about it. I think those are all of the fun facts that I have. The article that I found on HuffPost, it also has other like things in it, but a lot of it is stuff that I've already mentioned. Like there's something in here about the definition of slut, and it being just the definition of that being just as loaded as the definition of a virgin, and that's because the two are ultimately rooted in the same thing, in the controlling of women's bodies. Again, I said that earlier. And then what else? Messages about female sexuality are constructed by two paradoxical narratives that make it impossible for any woman to fulfill the ideal. And so it's like it turns the idea of the virgin and not virgin or whatever, it turns women against each other. It continues to perpetuate a cycle, and the idea of being palatable for the consumption of men. But then there's also a narrative that says women have to be this way and this way, or this way or this way. But we like this thing too. So if you like, yeah, she's pure, but I like my women wild and blah blah blah, but she's pure, so she has a different level of value, and so I'm not really going to marry the woman who is not quote unquote pure. I'm going to marry the woman who is, but I'm probably going to cheat on her with the woman who's not pure. And so again, it's like it makes it impossible to meet the quote unquote ideal standard of what it means to be a woman or whatever. So with this information in mind, I want you all to be very aware of how you use words, what words mean to you. Are you using words based on what you've been taught, and are you applying them based on what people have taught you to believe, and the conformity of a society? Or are you using language with the intent of understanding humanity first? Do not use such language to degrade women down to its least fraction or whatever. Pay attention to words. Question everything. Question what a thing is, why a certain group has certain words compared to another group, why a certain group has certain ideals and thought processes compared to related to it compared to another group. And don't just take everything at face value. Analyze everything, even something that seems as simple as virginity, because are these same concepts related to men as far as virginity is concerned, or sexual purity is concerned? Are these same concepts still related to men? But also, don't base a person's value on their sexual experience. That's not how life works. People are valued. People should be valued because they simply exist, because they are human. Man, woman, or otherwise. However you so choose to be identified. You are valuable because you exist, not because of who you've had sex with, who you haven't had sex with, how many times you've had sex. Body counts are not real. Stop it. All that matters is that you matter. That is all I have for today. Thank you so much for tuning into the GSMC Sex Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Ayana Hatcher, Ayana Janae, and I look forward to spending more time with you next week. Bye.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type in GSMC to find all of our shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From sex and relationships to health and wellness, life and happiness, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's episode of the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast.